And just to conclude this with a couple of more comments, one is that why it's called the axial age. We should go over that just really quickly. Um, Jaspers starts off by saying that Hegel had said that the Son of God, Jesus Christ, is the axis of history. He's the central pivotal axis point around which all of history has revolved. And Jaspers says, well, no, that's not the case. That would only be true if everyone was Christian, and obviously everyone is not Christian. So it can't be the axis of history. But year 500 BC is, if any date can be said to be axial in history, is that year, since across the board in China, India, and the West, we see the appearance of all these great teachers and philosophers. So it's axial in that sense. The second point to remark on is that Jaspers wants to know, why did this happen? He asks, what is it that caused this to take place right around the same time, right around 500 BC across the board? There seems to be some sort of synchronization involved. As with the birth of high civilization around 3000 BC, he says there, I think somewhat mistakenly, that there was also a synchronization. I think he follows Toynbee here, and that Toynbee had the mistaken idea that each of the high civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, India, and China all emerged simultaneously at about the same time as the result of a kind of spontaneous mutation in each case, and that all of them were completely unconnected with each other, and that there was a weird synchronization for the first stage, the first generation of these civilizations. That is very decidedly wrong. That is not the case. If you look at the dates of these civilizations, they're staggered. And the fact that they're staggered is pretty good evidence that we have here a diffusion of civilization, as Joseph Campbell tirelessly, endlessly remarked and expounded upon in his books with mountains of evidence to support it, that 3500 BC we have civilization in Mesopotamia. We don't get it in Egypt for another 6 centuries, 2900 BC. That's enough time for civilization to have made its way, and we know concretely that there was Mesopotamian involvement in Egypt around 3000 BC, so it has migrated there. And then later we get India, 1500 BC, that's much later, although you can push it back to 2500 BC with Harappan civilization, that's still far later than 3500 BC. 1500 BC with the great Vedic Indian cycle, and about the same time in China with the Shah dynasty about 1800 BC, followed by the Shang dynasty about 1500 BC down to 1200 BC. And then across the water with the Olmec in 1200 BC, we get, you can see that it takes time for these ideas to travel geographically across vast spaces, and indeed there is a staggering that very much argues for not the simultaneity of the genesis of civilization, but its diffusion from a single center in the Middle East, which appears to be where it came from. So Jaspers is wrong. I think he follows Toynbee, and I think he's wrong here in saying that there was a similar kind of synchronization with the rise of high civilization 3500 BC. But I think there is cause for wonder, though, about the axial period, which does seem across the board here, India, China, and the West, about from 800 to 500 BC, there's all these philosophers are doing something similar in teaching the individual a path of self-salvation that disengages him from the city-state and gives him the tools to survive on his own, basically to create his own microsphere out of jacking into the old macrocosm, whether it's the Tao or Brahman. Lao Tzu advises you to follow the Tao. Yajnavalkya wants you to find out what the basic structure of Brahman is and to connect your Atman with it. Later in Plato, we get similar ideas in Neoplatonism and so forth, and with the Gnostics and their dichotomy of light versus dark. And Christ is a kind of fossilization. He comes after this period. In a way, I think that the axial age in the Middle East should be pushed past 200 BC down to basically 200 AD, which is the period with the ending of the Gnostics. The Gnostics are wrapping it up about 200 AD, and they are the ultimate outcome of this entire development of these eschatologies and ontologies of the soul as a spark of light versus darkness, matter. In India, this becomes in Jainism the jiva, which gets infected with karma. Karma infects the jiva and stains it, and the goal is to, through purification exercises such as not eating and various forms of asceticism, it purges out the karma so that the jiva becomes clear. In Sankhya, the jiva becomes the purusha, The Purusha is in opposition with matter, Prakriti, which is animated by the three gunas, Rajas guna, Sattva guna, and the other guna. All three gunas are set in motion by the Purusha's contact with Prakriti, and the goal is to purge the Purusha's contact from matter, from Prakriti, from the gunas, through the practice of yoga. And in all these cases, these are techniques of self-salvation where the individual does not require a priesthood, does not require a state, does not require rituals and liturgies to do this for him, since he's capable of doing it himself if he follows the regimen of the spiritual discipline, whatever that happens to be. And it does seem to be interesting that all of this comes into being across the board at about the same time. And so Jaspers wants to know why that's the case. Why did this happen? Why is there this synchronization? One theory is that there's a certain homogenization of these civilizations insofar as about 1,000 years prior to this, in the middle of the second millennium, about 1500 BC, we get the coming down of the equestrian horsemen, the so-called Indo-Europeans, who enter into all three domains in one way or another. There are horsemen in China, not Indo-Europeans specifically, but nomadic horsemen who come in there. They all come in starting with the Hyksos invasion in Palestine. About 1700 BC, they come down through Palestine and they overtake Egyptian civilization. They bring the two-wheeled, horse-drawn battle chariot with the compound bow and arrow that was introduced to the Egyptians and that enabled them to overtake and overturn Egyptian civilization. Then they go across the board. They settle into Vedic India. They settle into Persia. They settle across the board as the Mitanni in the Middle East. And then you get different kinds of equestrian nomads in China, but also bringing in the two-wheeled chariot there in China and conquering there. And that may be, and I think Spengler thought that there was certain uniformity, a certain preparation that these men bring with them that lays the ground for all these brilliant philosophies that then come about 1,000 years later. But the question then becomes, why 1,000 years later? We get from 1500 BC with the Indo-European invasions. Then we get 800 to 500 BC with this response taking off, almost as though the motility of the horse flight becomes locked into civilization and is traded for the motility of thought, and all this brilliant thinking begins to start taking place. That's one theory, and Jaspers debunks it and says, no, that's probably not the case. The time gap, the time lag there is too far from the invasions to the religions of self-salvation, the new systems, rather, of self-salvation. So he dismisses that theory. Another possibility is writing. We get the alphabet coming in. Jaspers doesn't talk about this, but we get writing coming in, especially alphabetic writing, which comes in. It's invented by the Hebrews around 2000 BC, somewhere in the region of Mount Sinai, and is diffused. And it is possible it's diffused to Greece and eventually to India, although much later, and never to China, though. And it's possible that made it, because the alphabet is abstract, it's based on a criticism of the image, and it enables the psyche, the mind, the intellect to move into a new cognitive phase space that's much more abstract, since the alphabet is divorced from the sensuous, what Rudolf Steiner called the sentient soul, the sensuous pictographic images that act as a kind of mental glue that binds the psyche to the physical world with concrete sensuous imagery. But the alphabet acts almost like a neurological disruptor that breaks that bond and creates an abstract mental phase space in which perhaps new abstract thinking can move around now with a new kind of motility, like those horsemen, like those Kassite and Mitanni horsemen of centuries before. But the only problem is you don't have the alphabet going into China, so it can't account for an across-the-board phenomenon. And so what Jaspers comes down to in this chapter is that he says basically what has happened here is that in each of these cases there has been a similar, it's kind of a Toynbean challenge and response explanation. In each of these cases, they all had a similar sociological situation insofar as these city-states were crumbling, and they were disintegrating and falling apart, and in each case they had to come up with some kind of a solution to this problem. And the solution best seemed to be that since no one could really trust the priesthoods of these, and the masses certainly probably still did trust these priesthoods and the official state-sanctioned religions, but the thinking people of these civilizations did not. And so they responded across the board in these three domains. It's actually four, since the West is two domains of the Levant and the Greeks. came up with their own solutions in the form of these individuals who taught these religions of self-salvation: Zarathustra and Parshvanatha, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Pythagoras, Plato, the pre-Socratics, Parmenides, and so forth, all began to come in teaching these systems of self-salvation that is based on a criticism of the previous, now dying and senescent mythical age that is crumbling and falling apart. Prior to the mythical age, excuse me, Jaspers calls the dawn epoch of humanity the Paleolithic, the Promethean age, the age in which we have the origin of language, we have the origin of fire, we have the origin of tool making. That he calls the Promethean age. And he'll spend the book going through these stages. The Promethean age gives way to the mythical age, which in turn gives way to the axial age. And in Gebser, this becomes the magical structure, the mythical structure, and the mental consciousness structure. For Rudolf Steiner, this is the sentient soul and the intellectual soul, and then eventually, with Western high civilization, Atlantic European civilization, the consciousness soul, along about 1500 BC or so. So that in a nutshell is the introduction to Karl Jaspers' book, The Origin and Goal of History, that I now want to spend a few videos walking through as kind of a prelude to looking at Gadamer.